George had always believed that love, real love, was unbreakable. He believed that if he worked hard, stayed loyal, and poured his soul into providing for his family, nothing could tear them apart. But life had a twisted way of teaching lessons the hard way. Willow had once looked at him like he was her entire world. Back when they were younger, broke, but madly in love, George would wrap his arms around her and promise her a future they could build together. And she used to believe it. At least he thought she did. But things changed after their daughter, Anna, was born. George took up extra shifts, like sacrificed sleep and his dreams, just to keep them afloat, to keep the bills paid, the fridge full, and their child happy. But while he was out fighting for their future, Willow was slowly slipping away from him, into the arms of someone else. That someone was Ethan. Tall, smooth-talking, loaded with money, and fully aware of the cracks forming in George and Willow's relationship, Ethan swooped in like a vulture. George didn't notice it at first, too caught up in his responsibilities. But soon, he started hearing whispers. Then came the late-night texts Willow would quickly hide, the sudden weekend errands that lasted far too long, the way she started dressing up again, like she used to, but not for George. And when he confronted her, she didn't deny it. She just stared at him coldly and said, "You don't excite me anymore, George. I need more." That single sentence shattered everything. George begged her to reconsider, not for himself, but for Anna. But Willow didn't even flinch. She packed her bags, took Anna's hand, and walked out the door, leaving George behind with a silence that screamed louder than any argument they had ever had. For weeks, George sat in that silence, broken, drowning in guilt and self-doubt. He questioned everything, his worth, his love, his manhood. Meanwhile, Willow flaunted her new life on social media. Her and Ethan dining in 5-star restaurants, taking Anna on trips, buying her everything she wanted. And worst of all, Anna adored it. At only 6 years old, she was already parroting Ethan's arrogance, calling George boring and poor during their rare father-daughter visits. Every time she stepped into George's modest apartment, she wrinkled her nose and said things like, "Ethan has a pool. Why don't you?" Or, "Mommy says you never made her happy." Those words cut deeper than any knife. George didn't blame Anna. Not entirely. She was a child being fed poison. But it didn't stop the hurt. One day, during a court-arranged visitation, Anna crossed a line that George never expected. After George cooked her a homemade meal and tried to play board games with her, she sat back, arms crossed, and said, "Ethan says you're just a loser with a tool belt. Mommy should have left you sooner." George froze. The words echoed in his mind like a bullet ricocheting in a cage. He forced a calm smile, trying not to show the tears, threatening to fall. "Sweetheart," he said gently, "I'm still your dad. I love you, no matter what anyone says." Anna rolled her eyes and muttered, "Whatever." That night, after she left with Willow again, George broke down. Alone in his room, he sobbed into his pillow, not just for the betrayal, but for the slow, cruel erasure of the bond he once had with his little girl. He knew he couldn't keep living like this, drowning in misery while Ethan raised his daughter like a trophy. Something inside him snapped, not in rage, but in clarity. If they were going to paint him as the failure, the loser, then fine. He would disappear for a while, but when he came back, he would be the man no one could ignore. That was the moment everything changed. George deleted his social media, quit his job at the local construction firm. He sold his car, sold his TV, sold everything he didn't absolutely need. He moved into a tiny room above a garage, eating cheap meals and spending every hour grinding, reading books on business, investing, sales, mindset. He enrolled in free courses, worked security jobs at night, studied by day. No one noticed him. No one cared. But George was rebuilding, brick by brick. And as the months turned into years, the man that Willow discarded like trash was slowly becoming something else entirely. Stronger, smarter, ruthless in his pursuit. And even though he never stopped loving Anna, he stopped chasing after her approval. He knew that one day she'd see the truth for herself. But right now, she was still under Willow's spell, and worse, under Ethan's influence. Ethan, who bought her toys, gadgets, clothes, who let her act like a spoiled princess while whispering lies about George. But all empires built on deception eventually crumble, and George would be there to watch it fall. 3 years had passed since Willow had walked out with Anna and slammed the door on George's heart. To them, he was a chapter closed, a man erased from their world except for the obligatory custody arrangements that always felt like pity handouts. Every month, George would meet Anna with a warm smile and hopeful arms, but each time she'd show up colder, more dismissive, parroting Ethan's confidence and Willow's venom. "We went to Paris last week," she bragged once, swinging her designer bag like a trophy. "Ethan said you've probably never even left the country. Mommy says you're still fixing toilets for a living." George didn't react. He no longer explained himself. He just smiled and said, "That's nice, Anna. Did you have fun?" But inside, the fire kept burning, hotter, sharper. Because what Willow and Ethan didn't know, what even Anna couldn't see yet, was that George was no longer the man they left behind. In silence and shadows, he had built something powerful. What started as side hustles turned into scalable ventures. George had taught himself the digital world, e-commerce, online sales, branded niche, selling high-end custom tools and home improvement gear, using his blue-collar knowledge to dominate a market no one respected. Then he reinvested. He read every finance book he could get his hands on. He built an investment portfolio. He bought a rundown warehouse and turned it into a workspace. And when it made its first million in revenue, George didn't scream. He didn't gloat. He smiled quietly and worked harder. Meanwhile, Willow's relationship with Ethan looked perfect online, but cracks had begun to form in their castle of lies. Ethan, despite all his money, was arrogant and controlling. He didn't love Anna. He tolerated her because she made him look like a perfect stepdad. Behind closed doors, he was cold and dismissive, especially when the cameras were off. Anna, still young, didn't understand it yet, but the warmth George gave her, even in brief visits, began to echo in her mind, especially in contrast to Ethan's dry, transactional affection. Willow, growing more addicted to lifestyle than love, ignored the signs. She didn't notice that Ethan barely looked at her anymore when she spoke. She didn't even see the flirtatious texts on his phone. And when she did, she looked away. She wasn't about to give up the life she fought to steal. Back in George's world, he had started to grow his reputation. Quietly, he began attending networking events under a new name, G. Carter Industries. No one knew his past, and that's exactly how he liked it. He wore tailored suits now, drove a matte black Mercedes, bought a penthouse downtown, but didn't brag about it. George had learned the power of mystery. Even Anna didn't recognize his success yet. She was too fixated on Ethan's flashy lifestyle, the fake perfection of it all. "Ethan says rich people don't have to work hard. They make money work for them," she told George during one visit, flipping through her phone. "Maybe if you were smarter, Mommy wouldn't have left you." That one stung. Not because of the words, but because of how casually she said them, like it was truth, like she had no idea what George had become. But still, George never snapped at her. He never showed anger. Instead, he knelt down, looked her in the eyes, and said, "One day, Anna, you'll understand what really matters, and I'll still be here when that day comes." She rolled her eyes and went back to her phone. But deep inside, something flickered. Confusion, maybe even doubt. That flicker turned into sparks when the news began to spread. G. Carter Industries had landed a massive government contract. It made headlines. It got people talking. And though George never mentioned it to Willow or Anna, someone else did. At a dinner party, Ethan's business associate pulled out his phone and said, "Hey, this George Carter guy just closed a $20 million deal. You know him?" Ethan blinked. "George Carter?" he asked, his voice flat. "Yeah, tool guy turned entrepreneur, rags to riches. Pretty inspiring." Willow froze. The name stung. She hadn't heard it in a while, and when she did, it was always attached to pity. But now, $20 million? That couldn't be her George. Ethan brushed it off, but his jaw clenched. The next time Anna visited George, she noticed the shift. The car that picked her up wasn't his old beat-up sedan. It was a luxury SUV. The apartment was gone, replaced by a high-rise suite. Still, she didn't say much. "Are you dating someone now?" she asked, more curious than judgmental. "No," George replied calmly. "Been busy building a life first. Mommy says you were always too boring to be successful." George only smiled. Sometimes boring men become the most dangerous when they're underestimated. Anna didn't know how to respond. She looked around the apartment, confused. "Is this all yours?" she finally asked. "Every bit of it," George said. "But none of it matters more than time with you." She scoffed, but the words landed. Somewhere deep inside, her heart trembled. At home, things weren't as perfect anymore. Ethan had started staying out late. When Anna told him something exciting, he barely looked up. "That's great," he muttered, eyes glued to his phone. When she spilled juice on the marble floor, he snapped at her. "Are you stupid? You're not a baby anymore." It was the first time he ever raised his voice to her, and she didn't like it. That night, she clutched her teddy bear and remembered how George always cleaned her messes without yelling, how he smiled when she told him silly stories. The next week, George surprised her with something different. Not a toy, not a gadget, but a trip to a nature retreat. Just him and her. At first, she groaned. "This is boring," she whined. "There's no Wi-Fi." But by the second day, something shifted. George taught her how to fish. They built a fire together. They roasted marshmallows and told stories under the stars. And when she tripped on a rock and scraped her knee, George carried her on his back and made jokes until she stopped crying. For the first time in years, Anna laughed with him, not at him. And for the first time, she asked a real question. "Why did Mommy really leave you?" George looked at her for a long moment. He didn't want to poison her heart like Willow had poisoned hers, so he simply said she thought someone else could give her more. "I didn't fight her. I just wanted her to be happy, but I never stopped loving you." Anna stared into the fire, her young mind swirling with feelings too big to understand. Back at Willow's, things were unraveling faster. Ethan had been caught cheating with multiple women. Willow screamed, cried, threatened to leave, but Ethan only laughed. "You think I care?" he said. "I gave you a life. You're nothing without me." And then, just like that, he kicked her out of the mansion. No warning, no kindness, just a text the next morning. "Get your things. I've moved on." Willow showed up at George's doorstep days later, mascara streaked and trembling, holding Anna's suitcase. "Can she stay with you for a while?" she asked quietly. George stood in the doorway, calm and collected. He looked at Anna, then at Willow, then simply nodded. "Of course," he said. "She's always welcome here." Willow's eyes welled up. "You look different." George smiled faintly. "Success will do that." She hesitated. Maybe we could talk sometime." George didn't answer. He turned to Anna, knelt down, and took her hand. "Come on, kiddo. Let's get you settled in." As they walked in, Anna glanced back at her mother, then up at her father, and for the first time in her life, she wondered, had she been wrong all along? Anna had never lived with her father for more than a few days at a time, and even those short visits were filled with insults, eye rolls, and a complete lack of respect. But now, after Ethan discarded both her and Willow like broken toys, she was forced to spend weeks in George's world. A world that used to bore her, but now began to feel strangely safe. The change wasn't immediate. At first, Anna still complained about everything. How George didn't have a cinema room, how he made her do chores, how he insisted they eat dinner together every night without phones. But slowly, the walls she built started to crack. She watched how George woke up early every morning, cooked breakfast for her, packed her lunch for school, and still ran an empire without bragging about it. She noticed how he looked people in the eyes, how the staff in his office respected him, not out of fear like they did with Ethan, but because George earned it. When Anna came home crying one day because a group of kids at school mocked her for not living in Ethan's mansion anymore, George didn't scold her or tell her to toughen up. He sat beside her, gently took her hand, and said, "They only see surface things. One day you'll learn the value of what's real, and when that day comes, you'll never be shaken by fake people again." That night, Anna cried herself to sleep, not because she missed Ethan, but because for the first time, she realized what it felt like to be truly understood. Willow, meanwhile, was unraveling fast. She moved into a tiny apartment, posted filtered selfies pretending everything was fine, but the glow was gone. The luxury, the status, the access. Ethan took it all. And worst of all, he humiliated her publicly, flaunting his new girlfriend across social media, even inviting influencers to mock washed up gold diggers. Willow tried to contact Ethan for help, but he blocked her. Desperate, she tried to reach George, not for help, but to test if there was still something left. "George, I've been thinking a lot about us," she texted one night. "Maybe we rushed into things. Maybe you and I still have something." George stared at the message for a long time. A year ago, he might have cried. 2 years ago, he might have begged. But now, he simply replied, Willow, the version of me you wanted doesn't exist anymore, and the man I've become would never go back to someone who broke our family for a temporary thrill." She didn't reply. Days later, she showed up at his office uninvited, makeup perfect, fake tears ready. "George, please, I made a mistake." But George didn't waver. He stepped outside, met her in the lobby, and calmly said, "The only thing you ever loved was the lifestyle. You didn't just cheat on me. You poisoned our daughter against me. And now, I'm cleaning up the mess you left behind. Go home, Willow. There's nothing for you here." She sobbed, drew attention, made a scene, but George turned and walked away. Inside the glass walls of his company, staff watched in silence, stunned. Rumors swirled, but no one dared ask questions. George was now a man whose name was tied to respect, not pity. Meanwhile, back at home, Anna began to shift. She stopped calling him boring. She stopped comparing him to Ethan. One night, she even asked George to read her a bedtime story, something she hadn't done since she was 5. As he closed the book, she whispered, "Do you think Mommy ever really loved you?" George paused. "I think she loved the idea of me, but love without loyalty isn't real." Anna frowned. "I used to think you were a loser," she admitted. "Ethan and Mommy made it sound like you were nothing, and I believed them." George smiled softly. "You were just a kid. You believed what you were told." "But I was so mean to you," she said, tears welling up. "I called you names. I said horrible things." George pulled her into a hug. "And I never stopped loving you. Not once." That night, Anna cried in his arms, not because she missed Ethan or Willow, but because she finally realized the kind of father she had nearly lost. The next day, she went to school, and when the same group of kids mocked her again, she stood tall and said, "My dad might not be flashy, but he built everything he has without cheating anyone. Can your parents say the same?" They laughed at her, but she didn't cry this time. She walked away proud. The next week, George was invited to speak at a major business conference. His story had become legendary, blue-collar man to multi-millionaire mogul. Willow saw the video clips online and couldn't believe her eyes. That was her George? The man she said would never make it? The man she left for Ethan's money? Her stomach turned as she realized what she had thrown away. Not just a good man, but a future so solid, so real, that it made everything with Ethan feel like cheap fantasy. She tried one last time, calling George after weeks of silence. "Please," she begged. "I'm sorry. I don't care about the money anymore. I want our family back." George answered calmly. "The family you broke? The one I rebuilt without you?" "George, please. I'll change." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't gloat. He simply said, "You taught me a hard lesson, Willow. Love isn't about what someone offers you. It's about what you build together. I built something without you, and now you want to walk into it like you never left? No, I'm not angry anymore. I just finally see your worth, and it's not what I once thought." Willow broke down in silence. George hung up. And in that moment, the last chain of his past fell away. At home, Anna gave him a drawing she made at school. A picture of them holding hands with the words, "My hero," written above. George looked at it for a long time before smiling and saying, "I'm proud of you, kiddo." And Anna, now filled with guilt and love, whispered, "I'm proud of you too, Dad." For the first time in years, George felt whole again. Not because he had money, not because Willow begged to return, but because his daughter, once lost in lies, had finally found the truth. And this time, she chose him. The months that followed were unlike anything George had ever imagined, not because they were filled with riches or power. He had all that now, but because they were filled with peace, the kind he never thought he'd find after Willow shattered his world. His business had expanded to international levels, quietly dominating markets that Ethan's people used to scoff at. Now, they were calling George the man who turned silence into an empire. But none of that touched George as deeply as the transformation he saw in Anna. The little girl who once insulted him daily, who called him useless and said her real father was Ethan, now ran to him after school shouting, "Dad," with a smile that melted years of pain. She helped him cook dinner, laughed at his jokes, even asked to visit his warehouse just to see where the magic happens. And George gave her everything. Not just the toys and trips, but the lessons, the values, the kind of fatherhood that planted seeds for a stronger future. He taught her patience, humility, and above all, love without condition. One night, as they watched a movie together on the couch, she looked up and asked, Will you ever love mommy again? George didn't flinch. He looked into her eyes and said, I will always respect that she's your mother. But love, that belongs to someone else now. Someone who deserves it. That someone was Sophia, a woman George had met at a charity gala months ago. She wasn't flashy or obsessed with status. She was grounded, kind, brilliant, and she had no idea who George used to be. She fell for his present, not his past. At first, George was hesitant to open his heart again, but Sophia was patient. She didn't try to fix him. She just stayed. And over time, that quiet, enduring presence became a new foundation, one that made George realize that not all love ends in betrayal. Sophia met Anna, and the bond was instant, not forced, not manipulative like Willow used to try, but real. Anna saw how Sophia treated George with respect, how she didn't talk down to him, how she laughed with him like he was the most interesting man alive. And slowly, Anna's heart began to rewrite its own definition of family. Willow, on the other hand, continued to spiral. Her online presence faded as people realized she was no longer Ethan's girl. The sponsors dropped her. The fake friends ghosted her. Even Ethan replaced her with a younger woman who didn't ask questions and didn't demand loyalty. Willow sent messages, some bitter, some regretful, but George rarely replied. What could he say? That her betrayal made him better? That her lies sharpened his clarity? That she raised his daughter to hate him, only to watch that same daughter cling to him in the end? No, George had already said goodbye. The real victory wasn't in proving Willow wrong. It was in becoming the man who didn't need to. And Anna, now 12, began telling people proudly, my dad owns his own company. He started from nothing. He's my hero. Her friends came over, amazed at the life George built, not because it was luxurious, but because it was real. It had warmth, structure, and love. On her 13th birthday, Anna asked to invite both George and Sophia to her school celebration, but not Willow. It was the first time she drew that line herself. George didn't encourage it, but he respected it. Later that night, Anna sat next to him, cake on her plate, eyes sparkling. I used to think Ethan was the man I wanted for a father, she said, but I was wrong. He bought me gifts, but you gave me something better. George raised an eyebrow. What's that? Anna smiled. A heart that doesn't lie. Tears burned in his eyes, but he kept his composure. In that moment, every insult, like every betrayal, every year spent watching his daughter choose a fantasy over him, it all vanished. Because now she saw him, not the man Willow painted, not the loser Ethan mocked, but her father, strong, loyal, unshakable, the man who never gave up on her. Weeks later, George married Sophia in a quiet ceremony by the lake, just close friends, trusted allies, and Anna by his side holding the rings. She cried through the vows, hugging Sophia tightly after the ceremony. Thank you for loving my dad, she whispered. And Sophia, wiping tears of her own, said, how could I not? When the news reached Willow through social media, she didn't comment. She didn't message. She just stared at the photos. George, radiant and calm. Anna, glowing with pride. Sophia, graceful and steady. It hit her harder than anything Ethan ever said. Because that day, she didn't just lose George again. She lost the daughter she thought would always be on her side. In the end, George didn't win because he got rich or found someone better. He won because he healed, because he rose, because he loved when it would have been easier to hate. And as he watched the sunset with Anna on his right and Sophia on his left, he finally said the words he had carried in silence for years. I'm free now. Not from her, but from the pain. And for once, he didn't feel like a man who had been left behind. He felt like a king who had been reborn.